știm noi din vremuri strămoșești, cuvânt de dor și luptă, de doine și povești. Dar dacă astăzi pacea e lege și scut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. Țărul pe drum știut, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. E pentru că pe lume partidul s-a dulci cuvinte le-am moștenit în grai, doar bănuiam ce înseamnă, ce tâlcuri au sub strai. Dar dacă astăzi tâlcul de plin l-am priceput, e pentru că pe lume partidul s-a născut. самых окраин южных гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. Страна моя родная, слава ей, Господи, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и славу никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, подвиг и на труд. Страна моя родная, слава ей, Господи, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Над страной весенний ветер веет, каждым днем все радостнее жить. И никто на свете не умеет лучше нас смеяться и любить. Но сурово брови мы насупим, если враг захочет нас сломать. Как небесную родину мы любим, бережем, как ласковую мать. Страна моя родная, слава ей, Господи, я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет. Я другой такой страны не знаю, я такой на тысячу лет.
оклад, и нас не заклеит треск речей под барабанный раскат. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как все мы люди, то должны мы, извините, что-то есть. Хотят накормить нас пустой болтовней, чертям спасибо за честь. Марш левый, два, три, марш левый, два, три, взять ряды, товарищ нам. Ты войдешь в наш единый рабочий фронт, потому что рабочий ты сам. И так как ты рабочий, то не жди, что нам поможет другой. Себе мы свободу дадим.
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы. Будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы. Милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. This is the live stream as advertised on the murder of Henry Nowak and the role of the police. And I'm going to get to the main issue in just a moment. Before I do that, though, be sure to like and share and subscribe on the various different platforms. We are currently live on Twitch and on YouTube and on Rumble and on X and on Substack. So be sure to join us where you can. And be sure to subscribe to the various different platforms as well. You never know when one of them is going to get cancelled or when we're going to get kicked off one of them. So before I get to the subject at hand, I'm going to be looking at just some comments here. Hello to James Graham. Hello to Zamar from Phoenix, Arizona. Hello to Luca, who's got a question I'll get to in just a moment. Hello to Jerry, Pat in Bristol, Akhmadovich, Naz, Walter Stotzing, Jerry, Alex from Fife. You are free to do as we tell you. Speedy Bozo from Sheffield, Victor DE6584, Caustic Grip, Spanklin now, Svetlana in Moscow. And Spankler now says, with regard to Novak's murder, it was preventable. That guy didn't need to carry ceremonial knives. Well, we'll get into that and the details in just a moment. First of all, Luca says, question regarding the by-election. Is the Makerfield by-election going to be a stitch-up or all-out rigged? Are there chances of Burnham losing? It would be hilarious. The stitch-up's already been done with regard to the Makerfield by-election. It's already been done because they stitched it up by basically making sure that the two parties who could have damaged Burnham the most, which are the Greens and Reform, both basically have stood candidates that probably aren't capable of winning. The Greens picked one guy who had dared to suggest that the attacks on the Jewish ambulances were, and that the state put down to Iranian terrorists, that was like a fake out job, which is a reasonable suspicion to have. And then the Greens promptly ditched him and then picked somebody else who is not a very convincing political performer. The Greens have in their minds the idea that Burnham is going to be receptive to them being in a coalition after the next election, which that calculation from them is probably correct. Burnham will do that. He won't give them the reforms that they say they want, but he will give them a place in the coalition. It'll be an anti-reform coalition. Reform picked a guy who, let's just say, has an interesting history on Twitter of saying things which are bizarre and also seems to be, well, it seems they've picked somebody who's just not very good at doing the standard politician things. Now, some of the Reform defenders will say, oh, he's just a regular bloke from Makerfield. Well, you would want to investigate his Twitter history. If he's making weird pornographic comments, it's not going to look particularly good. Also, he's not a convincing performer either. So both those parties could conceivably have either damaged Burnham, or at least maybe the Greens could take enough votes or potentially away from Burnham so that Reform could win. Both have played into the Labour Party's hands by selecting duff candidates, basically, and making a mess of their campaigns so far. Rupert Lowe's gang, of whom more later, have also stood, which means that some of the votes that would have gone to Reform are going to go to them. They're not going to win the seat, I don't think, but basically it's all come together in a way that looks like, it could all still go wrong, but it looks like Burnham's going to win. And then Burnham will be leader and replace Starmer. The powers that be that are aligned with the Labour Party in the ruling class have already decided that Burnham's the man. And Burnham's the man from their point of view to sell the things that Starmer can't sell, because Starmer is a terrible politician. So like remilitarization, the ongoing war in Ukraine, etc. These things, the same agenda that Starmer has, but they think sold better. And also at the next election, Burnham stands a better chance of preserving the Labour Party than Starmer does. And let's bear this in mind. As things stand at the moment, there is a section of the British ruling class that doesn't want the Labour Party destroyed because they still find it useful for essentially playing the role it's played for over 100 years, which is of controlling and containing the working class via the link with the trade union movement. And they know that as things get worse for the working class in Britain as a whole, that they'll need that link, they'll need the ability that the Labour Party has still to squash strikes, to undermine industrial action via their relationship with the union bureaucracy. So Burnham is the chosen man. He's the chosen man to try and preserve the Labour Party, because if they stuck with Keir Starmer, it would be a fucking wipeout at the next election. With Burnham, who is a better politician, but they're picking him to sell the same agenda. So the fix is already in. You can fix an election in a variety of interesting ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be ballot stuffing or fraud, though those things I would suggest do happen in British elections. It's just not talked about. They happen quite openly in American elections. So you can stitch up an election by just making sure that the parties with a better chance of winning fuck up. You can, by various different means and methods, make sure that the Greens ran a shit campaign and fuck up their candidate selection. You can make sure that you can have a word with Nigel and say, oh, well, don't kind of soft pedal this one. We need this one to go our way. Nigel Farage, if you're not familiar with him, is a state asset, has been for a long time. He's deliberately promoted as a fake way of rebelling. And everybody who is in a party with Nigel Farage who tries to go off script, like Kilroy Silk did back in the day, and that reactionary clown Rupert Lowe does now, they're chased out of the party if they ever go near threatening good old Nigel. So there you go. Now, we are currently on a couple of hundred watching. Very good. So we're going to get into the story here. So if you're unfamiliar with what the case of Henry Nowak, he was an 18-year-old British university student who was murdered. He was stabbed to death on a Southampton street in December of last year, 2025. And this murder is not merely a tragedy. Obviously, it's a tragedy for his family and his friends, but it's a diagnostic window. Through this murder and the way it's been handled, we can observe the full architecture of the British state's coercive and ideological apparatus, how the police handcuffed the dying victim rather than his killer, how the media processed the case through a racialized hierarchy of victimhood, how the far-right and fascist movement has mobilized around this to advance the so-called two-tier policing narrative, how the British state's multicultural machinery has managed the fallout, and how beneath all of this, the material conditions of poverty, increasingly militarized and repressive policing, and the prison system reproduce the same racialized order that has structured British capitalism since the dawn of the imperialist age. This will hopefully be a comprehensive investigation, and I hope you find it useful. So first of all, let's talk about the case itself, the murder of Henry Nowak. He was killed on the 3rd of December 2025. He was an 18-year-old who was in his first year at the University of Southampton studying accountancy and finance. He was the first member of his family to attend university. He was originally from Chafford Hundred in Essex, and he was walking home alone along Belmont Road in the Portswood district of Southampton after celebrating the end of his first semester with his football teammates. He had a drink, but his blood alcohol level was well below the drink drive limit. He was not, repeat, not drunk. He was not aggressive. He was just simply walking home. He had his camera on and his phone when he encountered a guy who was a few years older than him, a guy called Vikram Digwa, who was to be his murderer. Digwa was 23 years old. He was claimed to be a member of the Nihang order of Sikhs, which is a warrior tradition that maintains the practice of carrying ceremonial blades. He carried two such knives, a small kirpan hidden under his clothing. That one satisfied the legal religious exemption for Sikhs to carry blades, and a much larger one, a 21 centimetre long knife, a ceremonial curved blade carried openly in a sheath over his clothing. Now, if you're not familiar with how long that is, I'm going to get a ruler out to show you now. So let's have a look. Like 21 centimetres long. It's about that far on the ruler where my finger is. That's a significant blade. And it's not something which is standard for Sikhs to carry. Like, I've met quite a number of Sikhs over the years. Like, they might carry small blades. This was a blade that could do some serious damage, and indeed it did do some serious damage to the unfortunate Henry Nowak. So this confrontation apparently began with just a really trivial thing, like the two walked into each other on the street. Nowak, whilst filming on his phone, jokingly called Digwa a bad man after noticing the large blade. Digwa replied, "I am a bad man." Now, what should have been a fleeting interaction turned into murder. Digwa stabbed Nowak 5 times, 2 wounds to the back of his legs, a fatal wound to his chest that punctured a lung, and a cut to his jaw. Nowak tried to escape. He attempted to climb a fence whilst bleeding heavily, and Digwa aggressively pursued him to try and finish him off, it would seem. Now, here's where the police enter the story and where things get even worse. Digwa's brother, Gurpreet Digwa, called 999, the emergency service number in Britain. The call was a calculated deception. Gurpreet Digwa told the operator that he and his brother had been the victims of a racial attack. That was untrue. He claimed that he and his brother had been subject to an assault, but he did not disclose in that call that Henry Nowak had been fatally stabbed. He denied that weapons had been used. He claimed that they had been the victims of a racist assault. This lie conditioned the entire police response. When the officers from Hampshire Police arrived, they found a confused scene. Digwa immediately told officers that Nowak had racially abused him and attacked him, claiming Nowak was drunk and stumbling a little. Digwa had removed his own turban and suggested that Nowak had pulled it off, a detail noted by the prosecution, who pointed out that Digwa's hair was in a tight bun during the pursuit, but loose when the police arrived. So the officers immediately believed Digwa's account. They handcuffed Nowak, who was visibly, fatally wounded. He was bleeding badly. The body camera footage captured the full horror of what followed. Nowak was lying on his side, repeatedly telling the officers, "I've been stabbed, I can't breathe." He told them he couldn't breathe 9 times, according to some reports. One officer replied, "I don't think you have, mate." They didn't bother to check. Nowak's pleas were all dismissed. The officers were not concerned with the man who was dying in front of them. First aid was only administered after Nowak had collapsed and lost consciousness. He died at the scene shortly after midnight, drowning in his own blood, handcuffed and ignored and falsely accused of racism by the man who had murdered him. Nowak's mobile phone, which had recorded the entire confrontation, was found in Digwa's possession. DNA belonging to Digwa's mother, Kiran Kaur, was found on the weapon sheath. Kaur was charged with assisting an offender by removing the murder weapon from the scene. Hampshire Police later apologised for their misjudged response. The Independent Office for Police Conduct opened an investigation, but no officer faced charges or disciplinary proceedings as of the trial date. That may change now. Now it's come to public attention. At Southampton Crown Court, Digwa claimed self-defence, alleging that Nowak had barged into him, used racial slurs, pulled his turban and behaved aggressively. By the way, none of that justifies stabbing a guy to death, even if that was the case. I mean, there was 2 of them there versus 1. So that doesn't justify at all pulling a knife out and stabbing a guy 5 times. Now, the prosecution presented the phone footage, the DNA evidence, the medical report showing 4 stab wounds and a cut to the jaw, and pointed out the contradictions in Digwa's account. The jury just took 2 hours to convict Digwa of murder, and on the 1st of June this year, the judge sentenced Digwa to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 21 years and 190 days. After the trial was conducted, Mark Nowak, Henry Nowak's father, spoke outside the court and said, "We hold Vikram Digwa solely and 100% responsible for the brutal murder of our son. But Henry should not have died on a street in Southampton in police handcuffs. The way he was treated was inhumane and degrading." Mark Nowak added, We do not want his death to be used to create further division, hatred, or tension, a plea that would be ignored by every political force that seized upon the case. Now, just in addition to this, I will venture into some elements of speculation here. The fact that Digwear was carrying 2 blades, one of which was far bigger than the regulation size, which Sikhs are allowed to carry, which other members of his family didn't carry. The fact that he was on camera saying, "I am a bad man," and then went and stabbed Nowak. This, to me, having been around a while, and experienced a number of, shall we say, dodgy characters in various bars across where the various locations I've lived in merry old England. Like, you start to know once you get past a certain age when a guy's got something pretty fucking wrong with him, or a guy is some kind of like time bomb waiting to go off. You can see it in their eyes a lot of the time. You learn that through experience. This guy, to me, this Digwear fellow, this guy's a psycho, and I would speculate that he's probably a weak man, quite a cowardly man, but who's desperate to be a big man. That's why he got probably quite obsessed with the idea of him being part of a warrior tradition, which the Sikhs in India, by the way, the Sikhs were formerly an empire. They were then incorporated into the British Empire and used as its armed wing, basically, in India, or one of its armed wings. So I think this is a cowardly man who's wanting desperately to be a big man and who's looking for the opportunity to do violence to somebody. I think it was only a matter of time before this guy popped and hurt somebody. And I think the fact that he responded with that line, then went for his knife and fucking killed Nowak, tells me that this is a guy who's just fucking wrong. And he, again, was waiting for the opportunity to either severely hurt somebody or murder somebody, and then panicked and lied about it and tried to cover it up and failed. But the point that I would make about the police response is that, as we'll see when we get into like the statistics with regard to injuries and deaths in custody, the police response is actually typical of the way that the police operate, which is that when they have a complaint, they don't often, again, this can vary via individual cops sometimes, but the typical way of behavior is that the cops don't actually investigate. What they do is they turn up and arrest, and they arrest with force. And as we'll see when we get into the statistics, they arrest often injuring people quite severely. So that they would turn up and arrest the victim and leave him bleeding to death, handcuffed on the floor, unfortunately, is standard practice. And the judge, I think, trying to defend the cops, but in actual fact condemning them, says, "Oh, it's often the case that suspects will fake injury to escape arrest." What actually happens is that the cops arrest people, severely wound them and injure them, and then say, "Oh, well, we couldn't get him medical attention. He would have escaped." You know, so this is a disgusting turn of events. There's no doubt about that. There's no way that any of this should have happened. There's no way that Digwear should have been allowed to walk around with a knife that was far beyond like the regulation length. This guy's clearly a lunatic, an aggressive, cowardly psycho who was I would repeat, like a guy like that is waiting for the opportunity to hurt somebody. He's probably been rehearsing the "I'm a bad man" fucking line in his mirror or something, like he's the Sikh version of Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver. But of course, it's no judgment on the great majority of Sikhs who are just like anybody else, like any other religious group. You have people in it who will interpret the doctrine one way. You have people who directs them towards charity and good works, which a lot of Sikhs do. You have a few of them who will be fucking psychos who will interpret it as a means to justify hurting people. Same way that some guys will interpret passages from the Bible to justify that. Same way some crazy guy or some psychopath who decides he's going to go and be a warrior for Islam and join ISIS or something, inadvertently working for MI6, ends up like finding passages from the Quran for dummies to justify himself. So this guy's a psychopath. He's been sent to prison for 20 plus years. A whole load of his family members got arrested, and his sentence will be reviewed. He'll probably do longer than 20 years, given the politicization that is attached to this case. But again, unfortunately, the treatment of Henry Nowak by the police is actually pretty typical. They do this week in, week out. And what's happened, and here I would recommend people go and read an article on this by the independent journalist Jonathan Cook on his Substack, is that the evidentiary standard for the police gets lowered and lowered all the time via political pressure. Political pressure from the police themselves and from reactionary forces in the political system. So when anti-racism laws were first brought in Britain in response to another murder that implicated the police, which was the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence in the early 1990s. The Macpherson report was commissioned after that, because the Metropolitan Police at the time, essentially deliberately fucked up the case so that the gang of white guys who did it got off scot-free. In the end, some of these guys got prosecuted later. They got found guilty of other things. These guys didn't exactly get away with it, but they got away with the first prosecution collapsed. And because of the ineffectiveness and obvious incompetence of the police investigation. It turned out that, the police made a lot of assumptions about Stephen Lawrence. They left him to die in the street, similar situation. And also, the police who were investigating the group of white guys who were accused of this, some of those cops had corrupt relationships with the family of some of the guys who were accused of it. So it's a case of police racism, yes, and police corruption. Now, again, I'll point people towards Jonathan Cook's article because it's a very good explanation of what's happened with the anti-racism laws. But basically, every time a law like this gets brought in, the various different laws did at the end of the 90s and in the early 2000s, every law that gives the police more power, essentially, it can always be turned against working class people, because that's the nature of the system. We'll get into the structural role of the police later. So where you get an anti-racist law, which when the Macpherson Commission reported, what was supposed to happen is that the police were meant to take reports of racism and racist violence seriously in a way that they hadn't done previously. That's what was supposed to happen with it. Now, what happens over time is that, again, the successive governments just overrode that and basically lowered the evidentiary standard, partially, as Jonathan Cook chronicles, in response to lobbying from Zionist organizations, but partially just because this is the way that politicians always roll with it in this country. So they lowered the evidentiary standard so that if there is a complaint of racism, along with the way that the cops often roll with other things, they just turn up and arrest on site. They don't ask questions. They don't investigate. If those cops had turned up to this call and actually investigated, they'd actually tried to talk to Henry Nowak and Digwa, they would have found out pretty quickly that Nowak was fatally stabbed and could have got him medical attention. Now, whether they could have saved his life, I don't know. I'm not a medical expert. He might have lost too much blood already. His injuries might have been too fatal. But the cops do what they always do now, which is turn up, rough somebody up, arrest them. And that's what they do for a whole variety of offenses. And the point about the anti-racism laws is that it was meant to be that the cops were meant to properly investigate these situations, not just assume that the black guy or the Asian guy or whoever made the report of racism or racially aggravated crimes was lying, but actually investigate it with an open mind and try and find the truth. They didn't do that here. They just leapt straight in, handcuffed Nowak, and essentially contributed to his horrible death, essentially. So there's no doubt that this is like a horrendous situation. And there's no doubt that this is a case that will involve, that has justifiably made people disgusted with the behaviour of the police. And it follows a pattern of police-involved deaths, whereby, because initially I checked into the media reporting pattern, and when Henry Nowak was murdered in December of last year and Digwear was arrested, there was barely any reporting about this. The media coverage initially was very low key. There was a brief report on BBC News on the 22nd of February that was noted that was about a football match held in Henry Nowak's honour. But the case did not break into sustained national media coverage during that period. The trial began on the 22nd of May. Digwear pleaded not guilty. On the 28th of May, the jury convicted Digwear and his mother, and BBC News and ITV reported the verdict. That was the first significant wave of national coverage. Now, it was the sentencing on the 1st of June that triggered saturation level coverage, with multiple BBC News reports, extensive coverage on the Daily Telegraph and the Independent, and the case then becomes a political issue. Keir Starmer described it as an awful, shocking case. Well, he'd know. That man was, of course, head of the Crown Prosecution Service, and would have been very well aware, at least should have been very well aware of like how the evidentiary standards for things were being lowered, how the police act when they arrest people a lot of the time, which is, creating injuries or making injuries worse. So his words should be disregarded. Now, Farage seized on it, and on the 2nd of June, Hampshire police released the body cam footage, and then the coverage reached its absolute peak. There was reporting on all the major news outlets, and then it crossed the Atlantic. Elon Musk, of course, picked it up, trying to make himself look edgy again by exploiting this. JD fucking Vance picked it up. Again, cheap political tricks from him. Now, again, the saturation pattern here does follow a classic trajectory of police-involved deaths, which is initially the news is suppressed, or they try and limit the reporting on it. But once it gets into court, and once there's a verdict, there is then an explosion of growth in coverage. And then if it can be weaponized, then it gets to saturation coverage. This has been weaponized by Nigel Farage and others to extend the already existing reactionary belief in a two-tier policing system. Now, the case of Henry Nowak has been seized upon by British right-wing organisations as a perfect instrument for their two-tier policing narrative, which is quite frankly, a conspiracy theory that claims that white people in Britain are discriminated against by a police force that's been captured by woke ideology, diversity quotas, and a fear of being accused of racism. The narrative inverts the actual statistical reality, though. In actual fact, in England and Wales, black people are 3.3 to 3.5 times more likely to experience use of force by the police, 4.1 to 4.5 times more likely to face usage of the police taser, and 3 times overrepresented in the prison population. But the narrative of Farage and co. doesn't require facts, it requires symbols. And Henry Nowak, a white teenager, handcuffed while dying, falsely accused of racism by his non-white murderer, was the perfect symbol for Farage and others. Now, Farage, who's the leader of Reform, has tried to benefit the most from this politically. On the 1st of June, as the sentencing dominated headlines, Farage called for the public to respond with pure cold rage. He argued that the officers appeared more concerned about allegations of racism than the condition of the dying teenager, describing the incidents as evidence of the negative consequences of years of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices within policing. He claimed that Britain has two-tier policing and that the officers were told to treat ethnic groups differently. During Prime Minister's Questions Time on the 3rd of June, that's just a few days ago, Farage pressed his claim that Britain was dealing with two-tier policing. Starmer described his call for pure cold rage as unforgivable, and the usual claim and counterclaim between these two state assets went on. Now, Reform in their manifesto, which is entitled Our Contract with You, does mention specifically two-tier policing and its common sense policing, not woke policing section. The manifesto promises to scrap all diversity, equity, and inclusion roles and regulations to stop two-tier policing. It states that they'll repeal the Equalities Act and do various different things which they claim will, make policing better again. But it's not incidental policy. It's their core ideological framework that connects their two-tier policing narrative to a broader assault on democratic rights in general, which is what Reform and Restore, the breakaway from Reform, actually want to carry out. Now, I find that the Farage's narrative on this is, of course, quite contradictory. It's not supposed to make sense because the reason why the police do act in this way is precisely because the evidentiary standards have already been lowered. The police are already able to rough people up, beat people up and get away with it, inflict quite severe injuries on people, which they often get away with. We'll come to some other cases later where the police have killed people, and again, the state has covered for them. Now, if you're a supporter of the idea of two-tier policing, and there are different tiers of policing in Britain, it's just not what Farage claims it is, then why would you want the same police led off the leash? Because it'll be the same police force with the same kind of people who join it. Same people who would have defended someone like Wayne Couzens, for example, the rapist and murderer who was in the Met Police for years and years and years, and who was known to be a violent sexual predator. In fact, he boasted about it, and yet the Met Police covered for him for years. Was he woke? Had he been through the DEI training? Let's be absolutely honest. The diversity, equity, and inclusion, or diversity training, has been something which has been very common in the public sector for many, many years. It's mainly arse covering in the police's case, the Home Office and the senior officers. It's mainly arse covering so that they can say if something goes wrong, if a black person or an Asian person is brutalized or even suffers death at the hands of the police, then the senior officers can wipe their hands and say, well, we'd sent the officers on the diversity, equity, and inclusion training. So, our backside is firmly covered. It's just an arse covering exercise. That's all it is. It doesn't change the behavior of the police when it doesn't change the function of the police. And we'll get into that function later on. So there were street-level mobilizations in just a few days ago. Between 1,000 and 2,000 people gathered in a protest outside of Southampton Central Police Station. Now, I want to say protesting against the police's role in the death of Henry Nowak is a legitimate thing. Being horrified by the way that the police left him to die on the floor and didn't bother until he was already dead to investigate. If a man's got blood in his mouth and claiming he's been stabbed, you can check that fairly easily. They didn't bother. They left him there to die. And so if people are angry about that, well, that's entirely right. Now, where this goes into, of course, reactionary political territory is who turned up for this protest. Stephen Yaxley Lennon, for instance. Now, Yaxley Lennon, stage name Tommy Robinson, headed the English Defence League. Quite what he heads now. It's been rebranded, but basically it's the same type of organization. Now, when Yaxley Lennon was the head of the EDL, he was actually, one of the things he trumpeted was that it had a Sikh wing to it. He doesn't mention that now, because back then Yaxley Lennon, who had been in, I think he had been in the BNP back in the day. He was claiming that, I'm not racist. I'm just really concerned about Islam. And look, we've got a Sikh wing. We've got Hindus supporting us. But look how quickly he just goes back to the old school playbook, because the idea that he's wants just a coalition against the Muslims, well, that was never true. Yaxley Lennon addressed the crowd at the protest saying, "We white people are second-class citizens in our own country. Henry Nowak was killed because he was white." Now, in the research that I've done, I haven't run into anything which says that Digwe's motivation was that he wanted to kill a white guy. Now, maybe I've not seen the document, but in my interpretation is Digwe was just looking for somebody he thought he could hurt and get away with it, and it could have been anybody. But the thing about Yaxley Lennon is that this revealed like what he's been about the whole time, which is that he was never wanting like a coalition with the Sikhs and the Hindus against the Muslims. That was just his advertising at the time. He's just an old school fascist, albeit one who's very fond of Israel. The rally was also addressed by failed actor Lawrence Fox, Nick Tinconi of the UKIP party, which is wholly owned and controlled by TPUSA, and the noted Islamophobe Posey Parker, who turned up as well. There was a number of arrests, and it got turned into a ruck. Now, the Nowak family had explicitly stated that they didn't want their son's death to be used to create further division or hatred, but of course, Yaxley Lennon, Farage and co. are never going to actually abide by that. Now, the reason why Farage has gone on this, run with this, is political, of course. Farage, as we mentioned earlier, the Makerfield by-election, his party's running there, and he's in a race, not with Labour to win the seat, really. It looks like Labour's going to win, but the breakaway, the Rupert Lowe breakaway, Restore Britain, is taking a lot of support away from Farage. Now, Rupert Lowe, former owner of Southampton Football Club, was elected as a Reform MP for Great Yarmouth in July 2024 at the last general election. Now, in March 2025, he was suspended following allegations of threatening behaviour. Basically, though, he was stitched up. He was probably going to be a threat to Farage's leadership because he had a big platform. He mouthed off a lot. He was getting popular with the Reform base, so they found something to drum him out of the party with. Now, in February of this year, Lowe formally launched the Restore Britain Party as a registered national political party. Restore Britain positions itself explicitly to the right of reform. Its policy platform includes strict immigration controls and mass deportations. Lowe's statement of millions will have to go is their guiding principle on this. It wants to reinstate the death penalty, ban the burqa and the niqab, abolish halal slaughter. I've always been confused about why people are so upset about that, given that the way that they kill animals in slaughterhouses ain't exactly pleasant, whichever way you do it. And Lowe says he wants a full-scale restoration of Christian Britain. Well, I've got news for him on that score. Christian Britain died a long time before the waves of post-World War II migration occurred. Now, Lowe also says that his party's there to provide an alternative for voters who feel that reform has become too moderate. Now, they have attracted a number of defections, particularly in the south of England, gaining a number of county councillors. Now, the Farage-Lowe rivalry here is not just a personality clash. From a Marxist perspective, it is a competition between two factions of the same class coalition, the petty bourgeoisie and the D-class elements of decayed British imperialism, for ownership of the same ideological product, the racialized grievance of elements of the white working class and the petty bourgeoisie. Both Farage and Lowe serve the same function, to divert working class anger away from capitalist property relations and towards racialized scapegoats. Both exploit the real material grievances of populations which have been abandoned by deindustrialization, austerity, and neoliberal restructuring. Grievances which, of course, find no expression in the Labour Party or the Conservative Party or the Liberals or the Greens. The difference between them is tactical, not strategic. Farage seeks to build a viable parliamentary force that can enter government either through a coalition or influence policy from within the institutional framework. Rupert Lowe seems to be seeking to build a movement that can operate outside institutional constraints, using street protests, social media, virality, and transatlantic oligarch funding to pressure the political system from the outside. And we cannot discuss this without discussing, of course, the transatlantic dimension. Elon Musk's intervention in the Nowak case, he offered to fund a wrongful death lawsuit, must be understood within this competitive context. Musk had previously endorsed Advance UK, another reform splinter led by Ben Habib, with the explicit statement being made by Musk that Farage is weak sauce who will do nothing. On the 4th of June 2026, the US State Department under Marco Rubio issued a statement criticizing, quote, ideological conditioning and two-tiered policing. Well, I wonder how many tiers American policing has. In Western societies, calling them glaring symptoms of civilizational decline and offering condolences to the family of Henry Nowak. This transatlantic coordination, from Musk's tweets to Vance's pronouncements to the State Department's statement to Farage's parliamentary questions to Lowe's street-level mobilizations, represents a new phase in the transatlantic organization of far-right and fascist politics. But here we must take a step back from this case to examine the deeper structures that produced the conjuncture where we are. The British state's formal policy of multiculturalism, which was formally launched by one of the great villains of British politics since World War II, that is Roy Jenkins, in a 1966 speech when he was Home Secretary. Now, this policy was never a benevolent concession to immigrant communities and the working class. It was a strategic response to the crisis of British post-war capitalism, the collapse of the empire, and the need for cheap labour to rebuild the domestic economy, and the imperative to manage the resulting social tensions without threatening the fundamental structures of class rule. Jenkins defined integration not as a, quote, flattening process of assimilation, but as equal opportunity accompanied by cultural diversity in an atmosphere of mutual tolerance. This formulation, equal opportunity plus cultural diversity, was the ideological shell that concealed a material reality of racialized exploitation. The core technology of state multiculturalism is the selection, funding, and elevation of so-called community leaders, individuals and organizations granted recognition as legitimate spokespeople for entire ethnic or religious communities. This operates through several interconnected mechanisms. First, the funding of ethnic-specific organizations. From the 1970s onwards, local authorities and central government channeled grants to community centres, cultural associations, religious councils, and self-help groups that were organised along ethnic lines. The 1981 Scarman report, which was produced after the Brixton uprising, which was an uprising against violent racist policing from the Metropolitan Police, explicitly recommended this approach. But this was not neutral support for civil society. It was the state actively constructing organisational forms through which minority communities would be politically represented, whether they liked it or not. Radical organisations, such as those that challenge capitalist rule or seriously challenge policing practices, were excluded. Conservative religious organisations and cultural groups that confine their activity to celebrations and representation were elevated. Second, the co-optation by the state of religious leadership. The British state has historically elevated religious figures as primary interlocutors with minority communities, a practice that actually mirrors colonial governance in places like India. In India, the British often relied upon native informants and religious intermediaries to conduct their rule. In Britain, this has translated into the elevation of chosen imams and priests and temple committees and rabbis and church leaders as the authentic voices of their communities. The 2005 London bombing saw this process accelerate through the government's so-called prevent strategy, which explicitly targeted religious institutions as sites of so-called de-radicalization. Now, if you've watched our programs before and have watched the Decline and Fall show, you can get an indication of what I think of their de-radicalization programs. More on that in future episodes. The religious co-optation has specific effects. It tries to replace any class-based political organization with sectarian identity politics. It elevates conservative, patriarchal figures willing to police their own communities in exchange for state recognition. It fragments the working class further along religious lines, preventing cross-ethnic class solidarity, and it provides the state with a ready-made community representative who can be summoned for consultations and deployed to condemn protests or strikes. Third, the creation of race relations as a professional field. The 1965 Race Relations Act and its successors established a bureaucratic apparatus. The Commission for Racial Equality later merged into the Equality and Human Rights Commission, local authority race relations officers, diversity and inclusion departments in every public institution. This apparatus professionalized anti-racism, transforming it from a political movement into a managerial function. The individuals who staffed these institutions become the human face of state multiculturalism. Their careers dependent upon the continued existence of race relations as a problem to be managed rather than a system to be abolished. The Nowak case illustrates this perfectly. The murder of a British student by a Sikh man was immediately processed through the lens of ethnic identity. The Sikh community's response, Nowak's community's grief, the racial tensions that the judge in the trial noted, the class dimension that both victim and perpetrator were young working class men, both products of the same deindustrialized precarious labour market, was entirely suppressed. In fact, it was not talked about at all. And here is the crucial point. The British state's multiculturalism and the fascists' two-tier policing narrative are not opposites. They are symbiotic elements of the same ideological system, a system that requires the permanent racialization of the working class to function. Multiculturalism produces the so-called community leaders who can be denounced by the far right as evidence of privilege and special treatment. And the far right's narrative requires the existence of diversity policies and community engagement to serve as its target. Both depend upon the suppression of class politics. Now, we'll get into the rights for whites element here in just a moment, but I'm just going to nip out and get myself some water. So please retain your seats, and I'll be back in just a Welcome back, everybody. So I'm going to get going again. So the the two-tier policing narrative emerges from like a history of British fascism, and it's a ideological descendant of the rights for whites demand. In fact, Farage came pretty close to saying that, and Yaxley Lennon openly does. Now, this did not emerge out of nowhere in 2026. It's the contemporary expression of a political tradition stretching all the way back to Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech. Enoch Powell, by the way, who was implicated in the Kincora scandal. Look that up. But his Rivers of Blood speech, which was given on the 20th of April 1968, was a starting point for much of this. Powell, who was then Conservative MP for Wolverhampton South West, identified immigration as the symbol of national decline. He described a constituent who had told him, in this country in 15 or 20 years, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. He invoked Virgil's Aeneid, the river Tiber foaming with much blood, to predict racial conflict. I find it funny how racists are always worried about the non-whites getting the whip, when it was, of course, the white hand holding the whip in the slave trade for so many centuries. Perhaps they assume that the black man will want vengeance. The political function, now, of Powellism was twofold. First, it served to racialize the increasing grievances of the white working class, grievances that were being produced by factory closures, the escalating pace of deindustrialization, housing shortages, and wage cuts, and redirected them away from the capitalist class and toward migrant labor. Secondly, it provided an ideological framework for a section of the Conservative Party to break with the post-war consensus on welfare, full employment, and imperial retreat. Within days of the speech, dockers and meat porters marched in his support in London, carrying placards reading, "Back Britain, not Black Britain," and "We want Enoch Powell." By the way, Powell was also a supporter of what we would now call neoliberal economics. So the kind of thing that Margaret Thatcher later did, he was very much in support of. And so what you have to realize is, like, the so-called free market or neoliberal reforms, or in reality attacks on the working class, always have to go hand in hand with an escalating, like, state-sponsored program of creating further racial divisions. Now, the National Front was part of this wave. They were founded in 1967. They were first organized as like partly a political expression of Powellism as a mass movement. Their electoral peak came in the 1976 local elections, when they polled 125,000 votes nationwide, including a lot in London. But its street activity, such as marches through immigrant areas and attacks on individuals from the Black and Asian communities, were much more significant. The 1917 general election, though, destroyed the National Front's electoral rise, when Thatcher explicitly adopted Powellite rhetoric and absorbed many National Front voters back into the Conservative Party. Thatcher said, quote, "People are really rather afraid that this country might be swamped by people with a different culture." And incidentally, though, the waves of migration continued all the way through the Conservative years in office, just as up to 1997, just as they did in David Cameron's time, just as they did again all the way through Theresa May, Boris Johnson, etc., because it's the demand of the capitalist class for hyper-exploitable labour which is driving this. Now, the National Front's failure was instructive. Explicit fascist symbolism, swastikas, Nazi salutes, and open biological racialism was, in the end, not a going concern when it comes to electoral politics. The rights for whites demand could only succeed if decoupled from explicit fascism and attached to more mainstream bourgeois political vehicles. This lesson was learned by the BNP, the British National Party, and the English Defence League, the EDL, ultimately by UKIP and now Reform. The BNP, which was founded by John Tyndall in 1982, who was an old NF man, represented the first systematic attempt to modernise British fascism. Under Nick Griffin's leadership from 1999, the BNP pursued a more electoralist strategy, explicitly inspired by the French Front National. They dropped the Nazi symbolism, cultivated a patriotic image, and they targeted local council elections in deindustrialized white working class areas. Their electoral peak came in the 2009 European elections, when Griffin and Andrew Bronze, who was an academic at the University of Leeds, I believe, were elected as MEPs, with the party polling 943,000 votes, 6.2% nationwide. The BNP vote was the highest fascist vote in British history. BBC Question Time, which was done basically to guarantee that he would go into a meltdown, because it really exposed the fact that, like, his party was ideologically incoherent, and all they had to do on that program was just bring up all the things that Griffin had said and done in the past, and Griffin ended up making himself look like a fool. He did make one point, though, in that confrontation, which was fairly obvious, but like no one else was making it, which is that people like Jack Straw, former Labour Home Secretary, were condemning him for his terrible racism, whereas, of course, Jack Straw, as a member of the Blair government, was responsible for far more non-white people's deaths via the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq and their occupation by American and British forces than Nick Griffin was ever going to be. This, of course, is a consistent weakness in the anti-racist movements in this country, which is they'll get up in arms about things that Griffin or Yaxley Lennon or Farage have said or done, but they will routinely ignore the very real crimes of Labour Party politicians, as long as those crimes happen, of course, outside of Britain and far away. Now, the EDL, which was founded by Yaxley Lennon in 2009, embraced street protest as its primary tactic. Yaxley Lennon, as I mentioned earlier, founded the organization to be explicitly anti-Islam rather than openly racialist. They framed their demands as a defense of English identity against what they termed Islamization, hence the Sikh and the Hindu wing that they had. This had advantages. It allowed recruitment from sections of the white working class who might not be explicitly racist, but held anti-Muslim prejudices. Anti-Muslim prejudices, of course, which have been stoked by the respectable bourgeois press for many decades now. And it provided respectable cover. They said they wanted to defend women's rights, gay rights, and free speech against what they termed Islamic extremism. The EDL demonstrated that the rights for whites demand could be mobilized through street protest rather than electoral politics, and it had to be hidden amongst a bunch of other things, basically. Now, UKIP was transformed by Farage into the primary vehicle for mainstreaming and disguising the rights for whites demand. Farage's big breakthrough came in the 2014 European elections, though he'd been around for quite some time before then, when UKIP actually topped the poll with 27.5% of the vote. This is part of what caused David Cameron's panic over potential Tory defections to UKIP and made him grant the Brexit referendum in 2016 to try and stave that off. Didn't really work out very well for him in the end. But the real significance, of course, was of Farage's rise was the Brexit referendum. Farage's breaking point poster showing a queue of dark-skinned refugees with the slogan "The EU has failed us all" was the most explicit racialization of the Brexit campaign. The underlying message that British sovereignty was threatened by immigration and that the white British working class was the victim of a cosmopolitan elite and that taking back control meant controlling borders against non-white migrants was the dominant framing. Incidentally, Keir Starmer has repeatedly adopted policies first pushed for by Farage and openly boasts now about being more in control of immigration than the Tories ever were. The 2024 general election saw Reform win 5 seats and 14.3% of the vote, nearly 4.1 million votes, demonstrated that the rights for whites demand could achieve significant electoral support if actually dressed up properly and attached to a pseudo-populist, apparently anti-establishment vehicle, which had substantial media backing, primarily from openly from like GB News and the reactionary press, but also more subtle backing from like BBC and others who constantly cover Farage anyway. And again, Farage is very much the British state's chosen man, always has been. Now, the rights for whites demand has a specific ideological structure. The victimhood narrative constructs the white British working class as a victim of a double betrayal by a cosmopolitan elite that has abandoned national sovereignty and by immigrant populations granted privileges denied to the indigenous population. The two-tier policing framing acknowledges racial disparity but inverts its direction. White people are the victims. The restoration fantasy articulates the demand as a return to pre-multicultural Britain that really never existed, and the anti-elite rhetoric identifies the enemy not as the capitalist class, but as a cultural and political stratum, professionals, academics, civil servants, diversity consultants who serve managerial functions within the capitalist state. By identifying this stratum as the enemy, the fascists and far right divert working class anger away from where it should lie, which is with the people who own and control the country. The material base of all of this is, of course, deindustrialization, increasing precariousness of the labour market, and the racialization by the state of British decline. The closure of coal mines, steelworks, shipyards, textile mills, car factories, and many other manufacturing concerns that used to provide stable fairly well-rewarded jobs for predominantly white working class communities has had a devastating effect. These communities were essentially deprived of employment, and then the employment was replaced not by stable, well-remunerated employment, by precarious, low-wage service sector jobs, 0 hours contracts, and of course with a lot of long-term unemployment, which is also hidden in the statistics a lot of the time. The housing stock was privatized, council housing has been sold off, creating a housing shortage, as we covered on the last stream. Public services were degraded by decades of austerity. This material decline was not caused by immigration, but immigration was used as the visible symbol of decline. The state's multiculturalism policy, funding ethnic-specific organizations and waving their arms around saying they're celebrating diversity, provided the institutional framework within which this sense of loss could be articulated as racialized political demands. Now, I'm going to move away from this broader picture to go back to the pattern of racialized state violence across Britain. So to understand the Nowak case fully and to understand why Yaxley Lennon and Farage and Lowe's claim of two-tier policing is not correct in the context that they have made it, we must fully understand other cases that reveal the systematic pattern of differential visibility and political utility in the British state's and media's processing of racialized violence. So I'm going to mention a few cases here that typify this. There's many others, though, and always bear in mind, when the media finds a shocking case, and there's plenty of shocking cases of police misconduct, of brutal murders, of horrific things being done to working class people, often by other working class people or lumpens. When the media can always find a shocking case because there's always one to be found. But when they blanket cover it, you have to ask, well, why? There's always a political utility being served by when the media highlights anything. And you always have to question, well, what that utility is. Because the media and the politicians who attach themselves to this don't really give two shits about Henry Nowak's death, his murder, or the horrible effect that it would have had on his family, his friends, and his community. They're always looking to work a political agenda, a political angle. So when a case gets highlighted, you have to ask the question, why? When a case does not get highlighted, with regard, then this applies to the cases I'm about to mention, you also have to ask why. So first up, the Mohammed Al-Ghazim murder case. Now, on the 1st of August 2025, Mohammed Al-Ghazim, who was a 20-year-old Saudi student on a 10-week English placement course in Cambridge, was stabbed in the neck by a man called Chas Corrigan, a 22-year-old construction worker. The men were strangers to each other, as Digver and Nowak were. Al-Ghazim was sitting on a wall, posing no threat to anybody, when Corrigan approached him, said something inaudible, walked away, then returned and stabbed him with a kitchen knife. Al-Ghazim bled out at the scene, despite efforts by passing doctors to save his life. Corrigan claimed he carried the knife to frighten off any attacker and did not realize he had made contact with Al-Ghazim. He was found guilty of murder after 2 hours of jury deliberation in March of this year and sentenced on the 3rd of June 2026. Now, the Al-Ghazim case stands in stark contrast to the Nowak case. Both involved young men murdered by strangers in English university cities. Both were cases where the murder was utterly unprovoked. Yet the Al-Ghazim case received minimal national media attention. No political mobilization, no protests, no intervention from American oligarchs, no parliamentary questions. The victim's family delivered a moving impact statement describing their son as their right hand and pillar of our household, and a kind, peaceful, and grateful and respected young man. But these words, of course, did not penetrate the national consciousness. The differential treatment does reveal a racialized hierarchy of victimhood in the British media political complex. Nowak, a white British student, became a symbol of two-tier policing and state failure. Al-Ghazim, a Saudi Muslim student, was processed as an unremarkable crime statistic. The state apparatus did not fail as spectacularly as it did with Nowak. There was no police handcuffing of the dying victim, but it failed through silence, through the systematic invisibility that renders certain deaths unworthy of political mobilization. Then we have the triple murder committed by a guy called Jamie Barrow. This was from 4 years ago. On the 20th of November, Jamie Barrow, a 31-year-old white man with a history of mental health problems and previous convictions for knife crime, murdered his neighbour, Fatoumata Hidara, and her two daughters, Fatima, aged 3, and Naima, aged 1, by pouring petrol through their letterbox and setting it alight. Barrow had been drinking heavily after being rejected by a woman he was messaging, apparently. He stood and watched the fire for 5 minutes, hearing the victims scream and die, then fled and returned, pretending ignorance. He was convicted of a triple murder on the 4th of July 2023 and sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 44 years. The Barrow case is analytically significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrates that racialized violence is not unidirectional. Barrow, a white perpetrator, murdered a black African family in a manner of extreme cruelty. Yet the case did not generate any sustained political mobilization or media saturation. The victims were Muslim, Gambian, and female, all categories that do not fit neatly into the two-tier policing narrative that requires white victimhood. Second, the case reveals the limits, of course, of the far right's racialized grievance politics. Farage and Yaxley Lennon have no political usage for black women and children. Third, the case illustrates how the criminal justice system processes different categories of offender. Barrow had previous convictions for battery, public order offences, and 2 counts of knife possession in 2018. Despite this history, he remained at liberty to commit a triple murder. Next, we have the Sheku Bayo case, a death in Scotland. Now, Sheku Bayo was a 30-year-old Sierra Leonean-born man who was training to be a gas fitter in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, and he died on the 3rd of May 2015 after being restrained by officers from Police Scotland. Bayo had taken MDMA and was indeed acting erratically. He was carrying a kitchen knife. When the police arrived, he did refuse their commands and did punch one of the officers. He was then rugby tackled by others. He lost consciousness shortly after and was pronounced dead in hospital. The post-mortem revealed injuries to his head and face, burst blood vessels in his eyes, consistent with asphyxiation, bruising across his body, and a fractured rib. The Bayo case demonstrates systemic patterns of police violence against black people across the British state. The immediate police response to a black man in a condition of, should we say, intoxication and a mental health crisis was physical restraint resulting in death. The investigation followed the standard template. The Police Investigations and Review Commissioner investigated for 16 months. The Lord Advocate determined in October of 2018 that no criminal charges would be brought. Only after sustained family campaigning did the Scottish Government announce an independent public inquiry in November of 2019. The inquiry itself became a demonstration of state obstruction. It has heard 122 days of evidence, cost £26.2 million as of September of 2025, and resulted in the resignation of Lord Brackadale as chair in October of 2025, followed by the resignation of the entire legal team. In March of 2026, Lord Colbeck was appointed as new chair. Meanwhile, Police Scotland's cooperation with the inquiry cost £24.3 million from the policing budget. In March 2025, an out-of-court settlement was reached with the Bayo family for substantial damages. Inquiries of this sort are not meant to deliver justice, but meant to indefinitely delay it, to exhaust a family's resources, to transform political demands into a bureaucratic process. The out-of-court settlement is not, of course, justice, but hush money, the state's admission of guilt without admission of liability. Now, the 4 cases here, whether it's Henry Nowak, Al-Ghazim, the murder committed by Barrow, or the death of Bayo, reveal a systematic pattern. Cases that can be mobilized to further the white grievance politics receive saturation coverage and political instrumentalization. Cases involving black or Muslim victims or white perpetrators are processed through standard criminal justice channels with minimal political mobilization. Cases of police violence against black people generate sustained family campaigning but face systemic obstruction, delay, and eventual financial settlement rather than accountability. The differential visibility is not accidental. It is the product of a media political complex that operates within the ideological framework of British imperialism, in which white victimhood is politically usable to some forces, while black and Muslim victimhood is systematically depoliticized a lot of the time. And before anybody jumps in there and say, what about Black Lives Matter? That was an oligarch-supported project that was an importation from the United States. I remember when Black Lives Matter marches happened in Manchester 10 years ago. The biggest ones were in response to developments in the United States. There were families in Manchester who were campaigning for Mancunians who had been injured or killed by the police for a number of years. And they never saw the mobilizations that were conducted in 2016 in response to the launch of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. People turned up en masse because of things they'd seen happening on social media in a country thousands of miles away. But they weren't turning up for things that had happened around the corner, which tells you an awful lot about how fundamentally heavily mediated and occupied by American media people's consciousness actually is. When something horrendous happens in a British city, you might get a few hundred protesting. But when Trump won the election back in 2016, you got like 10,000 people out in Manchester. Like this is how heavily mediated and overly saturated by American media people's imaginations are. It's a rather terrible thing to behold, really. Now, here we must talk about police use of force in England and Wales and the statistics of state violence. Now, the Home Office collects data on the police use of force under statutory requirements that were introduced as of April of 2017. The latest data covers the year ending the 31st of March 2025. Now, the total use of force reports for that year were 812,447. Now, that's an increase of 9% from the previous year. A use of force report represents one officer's use of force on one person. The most common outcome is arrest. Injuries to persons who encountered the police totaled 41,156, 5.1% of all reports. Of these, 20,628 were injuries during use of force itself, including 326 classified as severe injuries. Severe injury is defined as a fracture, deep cut or laceration, internal organ damage, impairment of bodily function, or anything requiring hospital admission. There were officer injuries were recorded as being 27,496 in that year. Deaths during or following police contact in the year ending March 2025 were 155. So there's 155 deaths during or following police contact in the year ending 31st of March 2025. So let's break this down demographically. Men account for 80% of use of force reports. This is, of course, to be expected. Men are more likely to be involved in violent encounters with the police than women. Men experienced a higher proportion of the most aggressive tactics. 89% of less lethal weapons incidents and 90% of firearms incidents in England and Wales involve men. Now, by ethnicity, white people account for 75% of reports, black people 11%, Asian people 7%, people defined as mixed ethnicity 3%, other 3%. But these raw numbers are misleading without the population adjustment. When we calculate rates relative to population share, the disparities do become stark. Black people experience police use of force at a rate 3.3 to 3.5 times higher than that of white people. For black men aged 18 to 34, the rate is 150 free per 1,000 people, compared with 43.1 per 1,000 for white men of the same age bracket. Black people are disproportionately subjected to the most aggressive tactics. They account for 15% of less lethal weapons use and 21% of firearms incidents, despite being only 4% of the population. Taser device use is even more disproportionate. Black people experience taser use at a rate 4.1 to 4.5 times that of white people, and taser discharges at a rate 3.3 to 4 times higher. On age, 48% of use of force reports involved people aged 18 to 34. The overall rate is 14 per 1,000 people. But for men aged 18 to 34, it rises to 49 per 1,000. on mental health. 22% of all use of force reports involved someone with a mental health condition. By ethnicity, white people with mental health conditions accounted for 24%, mixed race 20%, black 17%, Asian 14%, those defined as other 14%. The lower percentages for black and Asian people do not indicate better treatment. They indicate that mental health crises in these communities are less likely to prompt any appropriate intervention and more likely to result in police use of force. The Home Office explicitly acknowledges these disparities and cautions that calculating rates by ethnicity has its limitations. But these caveats are methodologically valid without altering the fundamental finding. Systematic racial disproportionality in police violence. These 41,000 injuries per year, these 155 deaths, these 3.5-fold disparities, that's not a few bad apples. That's the operational logic of an imperial core state's coercive apparatus. Now, the similar pattern emerges when we look at the prison population in Britain. The latest official data from June of 2025 gives a total prison population across England and Wales of 87,334. Here's the breakdown by ethnicity. White prisoners make up 73% of this, black prisoners 12%, Asian 8%, mixed ethnic group 5%, other ethnic groups 3%. Now let's again compare this to the general population. White people comprise 81% of the population, but only 73% of prisoners, so that's slight underrepresentation. Black people comprise 4% of the population, but 12% of the prison population, overrepresented by a factor of 3. Asian people, 9.3% of the population, 8% of the prisoners, roughly proportional. People of mixed race, 2.9% of population, 5% of prisoners, overrepresented at 1.7 times. Others, 2.1% of population, 3% of prisoners, overrepresented at 1.4 times. These proportions have remained remarkably consistent since 2004. The minority ethnic share of the prison population has hovered around about 27% for 2 decades, compared with approximately 18% of the general population. If the prison population reflected the ethnic makeup of England and Wales, there would be approximately 9,000 fewer men and boys in prison, the equivalent of 12 average-sized male prisons. The disproportionality is most acute among the young. In June 2025, 59% of under 18s in prison were from minority ethnic groups, up from 53% in 2021. Black offenders made up 25% of the under 18 prison population and 21% of 18 to 24-year-olds, despite being only 12% of the total prison population. By contrast, 84% of prisoners aged 50 plus were white. With regard to sex, black women are 8.9% of the female population versus 3% of the general population, 3 times overrepresented. On sentencing, black defendants receive sentences 55% longer than white defendants for similar offences, 28.6 months versus 18 months in this case. Asian defendants receive sentences 75% longer. This is not explained by offence severity alone. On remand, black defendants are 63% remanded at Crown Court versus 48% white. In Wales specifically, the disparities are even more pronounced. In 2023, there were 54 black people in prison per 10,000 population, compared with just 15 white people per 10,000. The average custodial sentence for black defendants in Wales was 25.3 months versus 16.7 months for white defendants, a difference of 8.6 months. On Muslim prisoners have increased from 8% of the prison population in 2002 to 18% in 2022, despite Muslims comprising approximately 6.5% of the general population. This represents a significant overrepresentation that intersects with both ethnicity and the so-called war on terror securitization framework. Foreign nationals comprise approximately 12% of the prison population, roughly 10,000 in December of 2022. These numbers do not represent a malfunctioning system. They represent a system functioning precisely as designed, as the coercive instrument of a capitalist class that warehouses its surplus populations, removing them from the labour market and from political contestation. The prison does not rehabilitate, it merely removes. It does not correct, it warehouses. In the words of one observer, a solution to the problems of surplus population surplus land, surplus capital, and surplus labour, but a solution that resolves nothing, only displaces the contradictions of capital accumulation onto the personage of the poorest in society. Now, the pattern of police violence and imprisonment, of course, must be examined with regard to material conditions that underlie the disparities in policing and imprisonment. Now I'll read to you about the poverty rates by ethnicity after housing costs. So in Bangladeshis, the poverty rate there is 53%. Pakistanis, 49%. Black Africans, 40%. Black overall, 40%. Mixed race, 28%. Asian overall, 36%. White British, 18%. White other, 10%. Child poverty is even more acute. Bangladeshi children have a poverty rate of 65%. Pakistani, 59 to 60%. Black, 49% to 53%. Asian overall, 47%. White, 24%. So whichever way you're looking at it, those statistics are abysmal. So like a quarter of white children in poverty, over half of children of Bangladeshi descent in poverty, over half of children of Pakistani descent in poverty. So this is a growing poverty picture all round. But those who are already poor, those who are already at the bottom of the ladder, so to speak, are going to get it worse. Now, the crime doesn't necessarily map strictly onto poverty levels. For instance, there's more black people in prison, there's more black people who get arrested, but the people of Bangladeshi and Pakistani descent, that community is generally poorer overall than the black community is. So really, it's a dual explanation. First, material deprivation. Poverty concentrates certain populations in spaces which are heavily policed. This increases contact with the criminal justice system and reduces capacity to navigate the legal processes. Second, and independently of this, state racialization, policing, and sentences these practices produce disproportionate outcomes for black people specifically. The 3 times overrepresentation in the prison population exceeds what poverty differentials alone would predict. Now, we get into our final part here, which is the purpose of the police and the purpose of prisons under capitalism. Now, we here abide by the classical Marxist understanding of the state, which provides our analytical framework. Friedrich Engels, in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, established the fundamental proposition, quote, "The second distinguishing feature is the establishment of a public power which no longer directly coincides with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because a self-acting armed organization of the population has become impossible since the split into classes. The public power exists in every state. It consists not merely of armed men, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, institutions, and coercion of all kinds." Lenin, in The State and Revolution, drew the direct conclusion. What does this power mainly consist of? Said Lenin. It consists of special bodies of armed men, having prisons, etc. at their command. We are justified in speaking of special bodies of armed men because the public power, which is an attribute of every state, does not directly coincide with the armed population. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power. This formulation is not metaphorical. It identifies the specific material core of the state, the separation of the coercive apparatus from the general population, its professionalization, and its subordination to the interest of the ruling class. The police and the prisons are not public services, they're not neutral institutions. They are armed bodies of men and women whose function is to maintain the property relations and class rule of the capitalists. In the context of British imperialism, this class function has always been racialized. The colonial police forces in India, Ireland, Africa, and the Caribbean were laboratories for techniques of racialized control, which were later imported back into Britain itself. The Metropolitan Police was founded in 1829 by Robert Peel, but Peel had previously designed the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was a paramilitary force designed to suppress Irish resistance to British rule. The techniques of colonial policing, surveillance, informants, collective punishment, racial profiling, these were all transferred from the colonies to Britain itself. The statistics demonstrate this with precision with regard to the disproportionate number of black people in prison and subjected to use of force by the police. Now here, Antonio Gramsci's contribution is essential for understanding how the coercive apparatus operates alongside the ideological apparatus in maintaining the hegemony of the bourgeoisie. Gramsci distinguished between political society, the coercive apparatus of government, police, courts and prisons, and civil society, schools, churches, media and cultural organizations. For Gramsci, the state is integral. State equals political society plus civil society. In other words, hegemony protected by the armor of coercion. The Nowak case illustrates this dialectic perfectly. The initial police violence, the handcuffing of a dying man, was the coercive moment. The subsequent media saturation, political contestation, and far-right mobilization represented the breakdown of consent and the attempt to reconstitute it through competing ideological narratives. The Al-Ghazim case, by contrast, demonstrates the smooth functioning of ideological domination, the absence of coverage, the lack of political mobilization, the seamless processing through standard criminal justice channels all represent the successful operation of the ideological apparatus in rendering certain deaths visible and other deaths invisible. Ralph Miliband's The State in Capitalist Society provided the definitive empirical demonstration of how the state apparatus, including the police, the judiciary, and the prison system, is actually integrated into the capitalist mode of production. Miliband showed that the state is not a neutral arbiter standing above class conflict, but an instrument of class rule, staffed by personnel drawn from and ideologically aligned with the bourgeoisie. The racialized dimension of this class rule was less developed in Miliband's work, but it has been developed by other people in the radical black tradition, such as Stuart Hall and Walter Rodney. The British state is not merely a capitalist state, it's an imperialist state. Its coercive apparatus carries the historical imprint of colonial violence. What's tried in the colonies is always ultimately brought back here to face us. Now, the two-tier policing is actually an ideological inversion of the reality of British policing. The apparatus is not two-tier in the sense of favouring non-white populations. It is class-based, and it disproportionately targets certain elements of the working class quite deliberately, such as black and minority ethnic populations, while simultaneously failing to protect them. The police don't serve the working class as a whole. In reality, when a working class community does have a problem, as many do, with drug dealing in their neighborhoods, antisocial behavior that often stems from the drug dealing, many working class people will go to the police and try and get them to do something about the drug dealing, about the antisocial behavior. And the police's response is often, nothing we can do, or they just ignore it. This leads to, of course, great frustration amongst working class communities, who will then often turn to some reactionary politician or another who will claim to be able to get things done. But of course, the police don't serve the working class as a whole. The police are there to protect the rule of the ruling class. And often, and this is certainly the case in a place like Scotland, where I sit today, it's been proved by investigative reporters and some principal politicians over the years that the police are often running hand in hand with drug gangs, using often in a deeply corrupt relationship with them. And of course, if they are in a corrupt relationship with drug gangs, they're not interested in responding to the complaints of working class residents regarding drug dealing on their estates. The working class is therefore left in a situation where the police don't serve them, but they have no other alternatives for actually dealing with, or trying to deal with, problems that exist in their communities. So they appeal to the police. Police don't do anything. Then another set of politicians come along claiming to be able to solve the problem. Another set of laws is put in place. Maybe the police finally respond and clean something up. But it doesn't solve the problem, because these crimes are replicated by the very capitalist system itself, which of course the police are there to defend. The only thing you're ever going to really get out of them is an imperfect solution at most. But again, what the working class is faced with is a policing system which is not built for us. It's not built to defend us. It's built to defend the rule of the bourgeoisie and the racializing of the working class, the deliberate division of the working class into racial and religious categories by the state is something which the police play their role in. Now here we reach our conclusion. The Henry Nowak murder case, the murder of Mohammed Al-Ghazim, the triple murder committed by Jamie Barrow, the Sheku Bayo death in custody, the statistics of police violence, the racialized prison population, and the data on poverty produce a single conclusion. The British state apparatus is not malfunctioning when it produces violent and racialized outcomes. It is functioning precisely as it's designed to, as the coercive instrument of a capitalist class that has historically depended upon imperial extraction and that now confronts the internalization of its colonial era contradictions. The 41,156 people injured annually by police use of force, the 155 deaths of people who have had contact with the police, the 3 times overrepresentation of black people in prison, the 4.5 times rate of taser usage against black people, the 55% longer sentences for black defendants, the 65% child poverty rate among Bangladeshi families, the £141,100 average wealth of a Bangladeshi household versus the 590,000 odd pounds for those defined as white British. These are not separate issues to be addressed through discrete policies. These are interconnected moments of a single structural process, the reproduction of capitalist social relations through the racialized coercion of the state apparatus. The structural nature of these disparities renders liberal reformism, such as better training, diversity initiatives, community policing, sentencing guidelines, fundamentally inadequate. Police and the prison system, and these are not broken institutions that can be fixed. They're functioning as they were designed to function, as the coercive instruments of capitalist class rule. The working class of varying different descriptions, but the working class as a whole gets chewed up and spat out by these. Working class people who die at the hands of the police, who are injured at the hands of the police, if their death is not politically useful to some scumbag opportunist or another within the political system, they will be ignored, they will be bureaucratized away, they'll be shoved down into an official inquiry which takes forever, costs a lot of money, and delivers nothing in the end. The Nowak case, for all that it's been instrumentalized by fascist and far-right politicians, contains a kernel of truth that the revolutionary movement must appropriate. The police did cuff a dying young man. They did ignore his pleas for help. They did act on a racialized script. These are not bad apples or individualized failures. They are the operational logic of a coercive apparatus's function is not justice, but control. The control of populations, the maintenance of their order, the reproduction of the conditions of capitalist accumulation. The anti-racist struggle as well is something which has been revealed to be inadequate now. The trade union bureaucracy, the NGO sector, act as barriers to effective building of working class solidarity. The NGOization of anti-racist struggle, the channeling of political energy into policy reports, diversity training, and parliamentary lobbying is the contemporary equivalent of the social democratic compromise that Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg identified as the graveyard of revolutionary potential. The two-tier policing narrative of the fascists and far right and the institutional racism framework of liberal anti-racism are two sides of the same coin. Both accept the fundamental legitimacy of the police apparatus, differing only on whether it requires reform or replacement with an even more reactionary alternative. The Revolutionary Party must reject both. We must organise amongst the entire working class, white, black, Asian, British and migrant, employed and unemployed, around the understanding that the police and the prisons are not ours to reform, but theirs. They belong to the ruling class. They are the ruling class's machine for the oppression of us. Now, this does not lead us into the realm of the DSA, etc., screaming abolish the police. Of course, even in a workers' state, you need a police function, but you need a police function which is more along the lines of a working class militia, which is subject to the control, democratic control of the community that it serves. The police in Britain and in the United States, though here we're talking principally about old perfidious Albion, they are are put there to be beyond democratic control. Whatever democratic control existed over the police many years ago, and some did exist into the early 20th century, was removed as soon as the working class got the vote. This is a bureaucratic security system which operates over our heads to control us, to arrest us and imprison us if we ever make any trouble. And the racialized element of that, the reinforcement of racial divisions within the so-called justice system, that is all part of what the police, the prison system, and the legal system is there to do, to control, to divide, to batter down the working class if the working class ever gives any trouble to the ruling class. The death of Henry Nowak, the appalling treatment of him by the police, this is all part of this system. And if we want to effectively counter it, we have to show it to the working class for what it is as part of our agitation. Now I'll turn to any potential questions that people might have. Right, okay. Nihat says, I'm around the same age as Alex. In the 90s, we hear, I mean, Istanbul used to hear English policemen don't carry guns. Was the 90s really more calm in Britain, or were you hearing false reports? You were hearing false reports. Look, there's always been in Britain violent undercurrents. Like, there's always been, like, the police have always been far more violent than they're portrayed. The way they arrest people is more violent. They don't need guns, but of course they do have access to guns. Like, most major police stations used to have a firearms cabinet, and they used to be dealt out to men who'd served in the armed forces when they felt they needed them. But there's been an increased usage since the 90s of firearms by police officers. This is the sort of misnomer. Yeah, the regular cop doesn't carry a gun, but there's more cops than ever carrying guns in the street. Does it make any of us feel more safe? No, it's not supposed to. It's not meant to make us feel safe. It's meant to act as an intimidatory mechanism. Okay. Sean says the police have favoured dealers, and these dealers are informers for the police. Yeah, that's very true. Jay Galt says, here in the US, sheriffs in rural areas are still responsive to the communities they serve. Refusals to enforce COVID policies, gun grabbing, etc. By contrast, municipal police are unaccountable. Yeah, I mean, in the United States, you still have some elements of like democratic control there. It's not in the big cities, though. Completely beyond control there, and pretending that you can secure democratic control over the police is a fool's errand. So that's why the DSA is engaged in it. Okay. President Jesus says, Britain tailing American political trends is the most embarrassing shit ever. Yeah, we'll try living here. Maria says, BLM, like this right-wing nonsense, is an American import. Yep. UK mentally colonized by former colony. Yep. Yeah, most of the political space is. It's a very sad fact, but there you go. Just shows where the relationship, what the relationship's like in terms of cultural production. The US is the dominant partner. The British still have an influence there, but American cultural products and American social media is consumed en masse here, so that people are far more aware of like what's going on in the United States sometimes than they are in their own communities. Right. So I'm going to draw this to a close for tonight. Thanks to, who do we have watching? Thanks to the over 500 of you watching tonight. That is excellent. Thank you for tuning in. What I'm going to be doing is Q&A session on for viewers on YouTube tomorrow, and Q&A session on Patreon on Monday. So be sure to tune in for that. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to, if you can, support this project on Patreon and buy me a coffee. Your contributions are what makes all of this possible. More programs coming up in the near future. So until next time, thank you for tuning in. Be back with you again very